Hello. As the press has been reporting, there have been a number of strikes in different industries in the United States. We have an ongoing couple of strikes occurring out in Hollywood among the writers and the actors. We last year had a really sizable strike among 48,000 graduate students in the UC Berkeley system. There's also an ongoing strike now among housekeepers occurring in Los Angeles, Local 11 of Unite Here, and then other negotiations have ended up in strikes. Some short strikes, some longer strikes. At the same time, there have been some negotiations that have been settled without recourse to a strike, such as the recent settlement at UPS in their negotiations with the Teamsters. So I want to talk with you a little bit about how we might explain both why there are more strikes occurring now, as there had been compared to the last couple of years, but also why in some cases, as in the UPS, there are settlements and there isn't recourse to a strike. I also want to speculate a little bit about negotiations that's just started within the auto industry involving the UAW and the three domestic producers, formerly referred to as the Big Three: General Motors, Ford, and now Stellantis, which is the current name for what had been Chrysler. So, in any case, why are there more strikes? The data show that there are more strikes this year as compared to strike rates over the last 5 years. An interesting source of data, by the way, is the Labor Action Tracker, which is produced at the ILR school. Johnny Callis leads that initiative. And the data show that the strike frequency has increased. At the same time, the data also show that although we're having more strikes now as compared to the last 3, 4, 5 years, when you compare what's happening now to the occurrence of strikes 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the rate of strike frequency is actually not particularly high now. But in any case, it's certainly higher than it's been in recent years. So why is that? So a clear explanation would be that workers have more bargaining power. The labor market is tight, as shown by the low unemployment rate. Fortunately, GNP is growing. Workers have more power, and they're exercising that power through militant strike action. Now, that's a simple explanation, and it kind of works. It works because it's consistent with what we're experiencing now. And also, historically, we've seen more strikes when times are good for workers. They have less to fear if they're having to go look for another job, or if the operation closes as a result of the strike. They have more power because the employer has a lot more to lose in good times. And so there's a good reason to believe that the presence of better times in the labor market has helped lead to more strikes. Now, at the same time, I say that it still is somewhat puzzling for those of us who had studied strikes historically because of the following argument. And I think in some ways the recent negotiations at UPS with the Teamsters will support this argument. And that is, well, if times are good, workers have more bargaining power. Why don't and shouldn't employers anticipate that workers have more bargaining power and improve their offer? And so you shouldn't necessarily see more strikes. You should see higher settlements, but not more frequent strikes when times are better in the labor market. And to some extent, again, I think the Teamster UPS settlement illustrates that. The UPS has been making a lot of good profit. The labor market is tight. The Teamsters have a lot of bargaining power, over 300,000 Teamster drivers. If they were to go on strike, UPS couldn't replace them. It's inconceivable that UPS could continue to operate. The Teamster bargaining power also derives from the solidarity they have with their union leadership, a new leader, Sean O'Brien. So that O'Brien knows, and the Teamsters have exhibited, if they go out on strike, the workers will stay on strike. They're not going to cross picket lines. So UPS had a lot to lose if there was a strike. The Teamsters had a lot of bargaining power, but they didn't end up in a strike. They settled. Now, they did settle with a very favorable outcome, if you've read the reports in the press. A substantial pay increase, a reduction in the number of part-time drivers, a narrowing in the pay gap between part-time drivers and full-time drivers, and some other benefits that the Teamsters gained. Makes a lot of sense. The union has more power. In this case, employers anticipated, I would argue, that the Teamsters had that power, and they didn't reach an impasse. Okay, so now we're back to the basic question. Why, in other situations, whether it's the Hollywood writers or actors, or it was the graduate students at UC Berkeley, or it's the housekeepers in their negotiations with the major hotel chains, why in those situations don't you see settlements, maybe very favorable settlements for the workforce, but not necessarily a strike? Well, that is a little bit more puzzling. My own explanation would be the following. I think what we see in situations like this is that workers do have more power, as for the reasons I've just enumerated, but employers are not accurately anticipating the amount of power workers have. Employers are basically miscalculating. They have a false expectation. They think maybe perhaps looking back at negotiations over the last 5 or 10 years when the employers had more power, they think that's continued. Maybe they think, oh, well, workers have somewhat more power, but not as much as makes it sense for us to agree to their demands. So we're gonna resist their demands. And it's that miscalculation by employers which lies at the heart of why there are those impasses. Now, again, it's kind of hard to figure out if that's exactly what's going on, because you'd have to be right at the bargaining table and understand a bit more about the dynamics of the bargaining in any particular situation. But I do think there's been some evidence that what's happened in those cases where there have been impasses in a number of different negotiations, employers have had to substantially raise their offer in order to get to a settlement. And I think that's an indication that perhaps what's leading to some, and maybe many of those strikes, is basically employers underestimating the bargaining power that the respective work group has. Okay, now a little bit more quickly, let me turn to the auto case. The negotiations have begun involving the UAW and what's referred to as the Big Three, GM, Ford, and now Stellantis. The UAW is led by a new leader who won a recent election. Sean Fain is his name. He ran against Ray Curry, who Ray belongs to the administrative caucus, as it was called, the Rutherite group that had dominated the UAW leadership all through the many years, starting in the late 1940s when Walter Reuther emerged as the leader, but continuing on well past Reuther's tragic death in 1970. And they had a direct election for the first time of the presidency in the UAW and other executive officers as part of a negotiated settlement between the UAW and the Justice Department. That settlement, I won't go into all the details, but that settlement arose after there was the arrest and eventual conviction of two of the previous presidents of the UAW who had been found guilty of absconding with funds in various ways. That was Gary Jones and Dennis Williams and all. And this, again, part of the settlement was a direct election. Well, Sean Fain won election. And Sean Fain won that in part running on a militant campaign. I'll come repeatedly back to that matter. He defeated Ray Curry. But here's another interesting point. Keep this in mind. Sean Fain won, but he only won by a few hundred votes out of several thousands of votes. At the same time, what I find interesting about the vote totals is even though this was the first time UAW members could directly vote for their president and other executive officers, in the initial election, only 12% of the eligible UAW members voted. the vote was really close then. There were some other minor candidates. They had a runoff between Fain and Curry. Fain won, but he only won by a few hundred votes, and the vote totals was a little bit higher. It was 14% of the eligible voters. I keep that in mind now as we're now turning to the question of what's going to happen in the negotiations between the UAW and the big three. Now, like other sectors, the workers in the auto industry are strengthened in their bargaining position because the economy is strong. The auto companies are making solid profits. And then they also have a leader who is ran for office on the grounds that he's going to be tougher than the previous leaders of the UAW. Well, God bless him, but at the same time that things in some ways are strengthening the bargaining position of the auto workers, there's some other conditions that are weakening their position. Auto workers, the UAW is the lead there, only now represent a slightly less than half of the auto workers working for companies that assemble vehicles in the United States, or as well taking account of the imports. They used to control 100% of the industry. Imports grew, and then we had the growth of transplants. And the noteworthy fact is that both the transplants and the imports are not covered by the UAW contracts. The transplants, in fact, operate in the U.S., whether it's Nissan plants, Honda plants, Toyota, Mercedes, some Korean operators. They operate non-union. And that's weakened the bargaining leverage of the UAW. In addition, the UAW is facing a shift towards battery electric powered cars. And all the forecasts show that will require less direct labor than is currently required to assemble a vehicle. That's a real concern to Shawn Fain and the UAW. And they've made a demand that says, we want the auto companies to give us recognition. Their catch is, I won't go into too many of these details, but the catch there is the battery factories are either owned by foreign companies, LG and SK and others, or they're part of joint operations involving the big three and a foreign company. And so that's going to influence what the parties can actually negotiate regarding the union status of those plants. Anyway, as you may have heard in the press, Shawn Fain is doing some untraditional things. He refused to shake the hands of the executives when negotiations started. He tore up the initial demand of Chrysler and threw it in the wastebasket. He's talking a tough line. And on the one hand, his line is warranted by the strength the workers there will gather from the strength in the economy. At the same time, keep those things in mind that I've already mentioned. He wasn't elected with an overwhelming mandate. He's a new leader. The industry is facing this transition to electric battery-powered vehicles. So what's going to happen? Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but my own guess would be that there's room for a settlement. There could well be a strike, because I think Shawn Fain may have to demonstrate his toughness by taking the workers out on strike. But I think there's room for a settlement. I've studied the auto industry for a number of years. It looks to me that you could imagine the parties settling along the following kinds of lines. The companies agreeing to reinstitute the 3% annual wage increases the auto workers used to get, the AIF as it's called, reinstitute a full cost of living escalator that would be part of a multi-year agreement, maybe agree to neutrality in the elections that occur in the jointly owned battery factories, maybe agree to narrow the gap between the lower tier auto workers who have been hired since 2008 and the top tier of already long-standing auto workers, maybe reduce the number of temporary workers. Those are all issues that have been raised by Shawn Fain and the UAW bargaining committee. And I can imagine a settlement emerging. At the same time, maybe there's going to be a miscalculation, somewhat analogous to the miscalculation that I claim may have led to some of the other strikes we've seen. Maybe Shawn Fain's going to reach for so much, the auto companies just won't meet those demands. Maybe the auto companies won't recognize how much leverage the UAW has. UAW also has a lot of leverage. I haven't gone on to explain that. Workers can't be replaced in the big three. You can't run auto factories by bringing in a new 150,000 workers. And in other ways, the UAW workers have strength. Yeah, there wasn't a big turnout for the presidential election, but there's enough solidarity in the UAW where I think the union could call a strike and the workers would honor the picket lines. They're not going to cross the picket lines and break the strike that way. So it's an interesting negotiations to watch. We'll have to see whether it goes the route of the Teamster UPS settlement with a strong settlement, but the avoidance of an impasse, or rather it looks more like the negotiations we've seen in Hollywood or in some of the other cases, like the railroad industry I didn't even mention a couple of months ago had a major impasse. So time will tell, and those of us involved in the study of conflict resolution will have some more material to discuss and debate. Well, thanks again for listening to me go on about the strikes and the impasse in autos. That you can tell I really care a lot about what's happening there. It keeps me up at night thinking about what's going on, and I look forward to talking with you about the outcomes in subsequent director reports like this. Take care.